undermining existing commitments and would have devastating humanitarian consequences for Yemen's people, who have already endured nearly a decade of unimaginable hardship. A return to widespread violence would trigger further displacement, collapse essential services, and exacerbate the already dire humanitarian crisis, pushing Yemen further away from the peace it so desperately needs. It could erase the hard-earned progress in de-escalation and erode the fragile trust necessary to advance a sustainable peace process. For the sake of the Yemeni people and to preserve the possibilities for peace, I urge all parties to refrain from actions that deepen suffering or could undo the progress made to date. Mr. President, my office has engaged in extensive dialogues with both parties at the technical level on economic issues, and I welcome their candid engagement, acknowledgement of the pressing economic challenges, and shared aspiration for a better future for all Yemenis. In addition, we are working closely with key actors from the banking and private sectors to identify measures needed for Yemen's economic recovery and to prepare for a broader dialogue on the economy. The ongoing economic deterioration across Yemen is impacting everyone, particularly the most vulnerable. While the government of Yemen and Ansar Allah have each taken steps to address the crisis, these broader structural challenges at hand must be addressed through collaboration. In our discussions, we explored how collaboration between the parties could unlock critical peace dividends. These include the unification of the central bank, the resumption of fossil fuel exports, and the full payment of public sector salaries. The parties must act decisively and not delay making progress on tangible opportunities due to imagined future scenarios. Time is not on our side, and delays will only worsen the suffering of those who have already endured so much. The cost of inaction will be profound, with the heaviest burden falling on Yemen's most vulnerable populations. Our efforts remain focused on creating pathways to sustainable peace. My office continues to facilitate a series of political dialogues involving Yemeni political parties, civil society actors, key stakeholders, and prominent experts. These initiatives prioritize the meaningful participation of women and youth, ensuring their voices are central to shaping an inclusive vision for Yemen's future. These efforts are critical in laying the foundation for a broader political process. Complementing these dialogues, we are conducting consultations to amplify the perspectives of marginalized groups. In parallel, my office has engaged with representatives of the Military Coordination Committee to advance steps towards achieving a nationwide ceasefire. We also continue our work to convene the parties' prisoners' committees and urge all sides to persist in their efforts towards the release of conflict-related detainees on an all-for-all basis. Prioritizing this humanitarian file is not only essential for alleviating immediate suffering, but also represents a critical step in creating a foundation for broader agreements. Such actions demonstrate a genuine commitment to advancing the peace process and signal a willingness to prioritize the well-being of those affected by the conflict. Mr. President, while the oncoming year will not be without challenges, my determination to safeguard the progress made to date on the roadmap and keep focus on the prospects for peace in Yemen remains intact. De-escalation is needed in the wider region, and the United Nations' active work towards this goal must be supported. A stable, peaceful Yemen benefits all, and efforts must align with the aspirations of its people for peace, dignity, and a future free from the shadow of war. Against this backdrop of escalation and future uncertainty in the region, I am concerned that parties may reassess their options for peace and make miscalculations based on flawed assumptions. The unity of this Council and its consistent messaging to the parties on the importance of a negotiated settlement will be pivotal in the months ahead. Your commitment has been instrumental in reinforcing international expectation for progress and in demonstrating a shared resolve to support Yemen on its path to peace. As we navigate the challenges ahead, this steadfastness will remain vital, not only in safeguarding the progress made to date on the elements of the roadmap, but also in advancing a comprehensive political settlement and upholding the hope of a brighter, more stable future for the Yemeni people. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Madame Suya.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me wish Council members a Happy New Year and also thank General Barry for his service. I also thank Special Envoy Grunberg for his briefing and his unfaltering efforts to bring about peace for the people of Yemen. Mr. President, hostilities in and around Yemen and the wider region have persisted, with increasingly alarming humanitarian repercussions for civilians. The Houthis have continued to target Israel with drones and missiles, causing several civilian injuries and damaging a school near Tel Aviv and homes in Jaffa. Israeli airstrikes on Hodeidah and Sana'a have killed and injured dozens of civilians and have caused significant damage to civilian infrastructure. Overall, the last month has seen a concerning increase in attacks against vital civilian infrastructure upon which millions of people depend for electricity, safe movement, and the import of essential food and medical supplies. Following a series of airstrikes, the most recent one being on Al Hodeidah and Ras Isa ports on 10 January, Yemen's Red Sea ports have sustained substantial damage, leading to a significant reduction in their capacities. In particular, Al Hodeidah port, a critical gateway to not only humanitarian supplies, but also fuel and commercial goods, operates at approximately 30% of its capacity based on best current estimates. Yemen relies on imports for over 2/3 of the food and some 90% of all medicine and medical supplies for the population. Humanitarians depend on these seaports to bring in life-saving humanitarian supplies, including food and medicine. Impairing their operations causes direct and immense civilian hardship and suffering. Infrastructure that plays such an indispensable role must be spared. Mr. President, as was widely reported, the Israeli attack on Sana'a International Airport on 26 December took place while a commercial passenger flight was landing. Though the flight fortunately avoided harm and the strike resulted in the deaths of at least 3 civilians and injuries to 30 more, including a crew member of the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, Julian Harness, and other UN colleagues were also present at the airport at that time. The airport sustained substantial damage, notably the destruction of the air traffic control tower, presenting concerns about flight safety and the safe movement of passengers going forwards. Like Yemen's Red Sea ports, Sana'a Airport is vital for humanitarian operations. It is a lifeline for the movement of civilians, humanitarian workers, and life-saving supplies. Disruptions to airport operations will directly impact our ability to deliver and will adversely affect civilians, including those who need to travel abroad to seek medical care. I reiterate the Secretary General's demand that all parties respect international humanitarian law to protect civilians and do everything they can to spare infrastructure that civilians rely on. Mr. President, Dr. Tedros was in Yemen to negotiate the release of UN and other personnel detained by the Houthis and to discuss the humanitarian situation with partners and officials. His engagements resulted in commitment from the Houthi de facto authorities to first explore a pathway leading to the release of all detained staff, and second, improve the conditions under which they are detained until their release. I take this opportunity to urge the Houthi de facto authorities to uphold this commitment and to heed the Secretary General's call for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN and NGO personnel. Mr. President, people in Yemen continue to face a severe humanitarian and protection crisis. According to the Consolidated Humanitarian Appeal for 2025, which will be released shortly, the crisis is getting worse. At least 19.5 million people in Yemen need humanitarian assistance and protection this year, 1.3 million more than in 2024. Almost half of Yemen's population, over 17 million people, is unable to meet their basic food needs. The most marginalized, including women and girls, those displaced, and communities such as the Muhammadin, are the worst affected. Almost half of all children under the age of 5 suffer from moderate to severe stunting caused by malnutrition. Cholera is at appalling levels. The World Health Organization reports that Yemen bore the highest global burden of cholera in 2024, accounting for 35% of cholera cases and 18% of related deaths worldwide. This alone has added enormous burdens on a health system that is already severely stressed. On top of this, an estimated 4.8 million people remain internally displaced. The majority of them are women and children. Mr. President, we remain committed to assisting those in need across Yemen. For this, we need support from this Council and from our donors to deliver life-saving humanitarian activities at the required scale, and we need the facilitation of principled humanitarian access. I am encouraged to report that modest but sustained progress is being achieved on this last front. Last month, a UN mission led by the resident and humanitarian coordinator crossed the front line in Taiz city for the first time since 2016, building on the community's local initiatives. Over recent months, we have also seen the expedited approval of visas for international staff and agreements with NGO partners in Houthi-controlled areas, an encouraging development in addressing the bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian operation. Mr. President, last month, Under-Secretary General Fletcher asked for the Security Council's support on 3 concrete points. As we enter a new constellation for this Council, I would reiterate these points consistent with my remarks today. First, your collective influence to ensure full respect for international humanitarian law. This entails ensuring critical civilian infrastructure is spared, including the ports, airports, water, and electricity networks. Damaging this infrastructure can harm, first and foremost, those civilians already suffering and those most in need. Second, support for full humanitarian funding to ensure the people of Yemen caught in this decade-long crisis can have some hope. And third, ongoing and unwavering support for Special Envoy Grunberg's efforts to enable the resumption of a peaceful, inclusive, orderly, and Yemeni-led political transition process. Ultimately, the shortest and surest way out of a decade of suffering and humanitarian crisis in Yemen is through a lasting political resolution. In addition, and in support for Dr. Tedros' efforts on the ground in late December, I would ask this Council to support all efforts to secure the safe release of all detained UN and other humanitarian personnel. Mr. President, I hope we can find a better path forwards to find a resolution to this crisis and stand ready to work with you in that endeavor. Thank you.
I thank Mrs. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Special Envoy Grinberg and Deputy Under-Secretary Masuya for your important briefings today. I'll make 3 points today. First, we welcome the visits and the continuing efforts of both WHO Director General Tedros and Special Envoy Grinberg to secure the release of detainees. We are deeply concerned about Houthi claims of further arbitrary and unlawful detentions of Yemeni citizens. We call on this Council to unite in condemning Houthi detentions in the strongest terms and demand that the Houthis immediately and unconditionally release all those detained, enabling a safe operating environment for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to those most in need. And this is more important than ever, with nearly 20 million Yemenis now in need of assistance, as Ms. Masuya spelled out so starkly for us. Second, the UK will continue to support freedom of navigation, including in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and we look forward to the extension later today of the mandate of UNSCR 2722. The UK condemns the ongoing and reckless Houthi attacks against Israeli population centres. We are clear on Israel's right to self-defense against these attacks, but this must be done in compliance with Israel's IHL obligations, including the need to avoid damage to critical civilian infrastructure, such as Hodeidah Port, the main entry point for food and humanitarian supplies into Yemen. Third, the UK is resolute in our support to the government of Yemen, and that is why we are co-hosting an event this month to galvanise international support for the government as the legitimate representative of the Yemeni people, and in order to promote stability and stable governance. Yemen can only truly prosper when all Yemenis are able to play their role in building a better future for their country. Finally, President, on the occasion of General Beery's final briefing to this Council, I'd like to commend and appreciate his efforts in support of UNMAHA and the Yemeni people in Hodeidah Governorate. I thank him for his service. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to Panama.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Panamá agradece a la presidencia
Panama
del
is grateful
Consejo
to the presidency
por
of
la
the
convocatoria
Council
de esta
for
reunión,
convening
así
this
como
meeting,
también al enviado
as well as
especial del
to the
secretario
Special
general
Envoy
para
of the
Yemen,
Secretary General for
señor
Yemen,
Hans Grunberg,
Mr. Hans
y a la
Grunberg,
subsecretaria
and
general
to
de
the
Asuntos
Assistant Secretary
Humanitarios y
General for
coordinadora
Humanitarian
adjunta
Affairs
del Socorro de
and
Emergencia,
Deputy Coordinator of
Joyce
Emergency
Msuya,
Relief,
por sus
Joyce
valiosas
Masuya, for their
intervenciones.
very valuable
La
briefings.
República de
The
Panamá
Republic of Panama
expresa su profunda
would like to
preocupación
express its
por el aumento de las
deep
tensiones en
dismay
Yemen, la
about the
grave
increase
crisis
in tensions
humanitaria
in
que
Yemen
afecta a la
and the
región,
very severe
el
humanitarian
continuo
crisis that
deterioro de
affects
la
the region
situación
and the
en el Mar
continuing
Rojo.
deterioration of the situation in the
Seguimos
Red
muy
Sea.
de cerca
We are
las
following
acciones
very
y esfuerzos
closely
del
the
enviado
actions and
especial de
efforts
las
of the
Naciones
Special
Unidas para
Envoy of the
Yemen,
United Nations for
reconociendo el
Yemen,
valor de su labor
acknowledging the
en la promoción
value
de la
of his
paz y la estabilidad en la región.
work in promoting peace and
Asimismo,
stability in the region.
apoyamos los
Also,
esfuerzos
we
para
support
crear un espacio político
efforts
adecuado
to create
y
an
reanudar un
appropriate
diálogo
political space
constructivo
and
que conduzca a una solución
restore a
política
constructive
sostenible
dialogue
del
that leads
conflicto,
to a sustainable political
garantizando
solution of the
un futuro
conflict, guaranteeing
estable
a
para el
stable
pueblo
future
yemení.
for the Yemeni people.
La situación
The
humanitaria en Yemen
humanitarian
continúa
situation in Yemen
deteriorándose.
continues to
Según el
deteriorate.
panorama
According to the
humanitario global de la
global
OCHA
humanitarian
para
panorama of
2025,
OCHA for 2025,
19.5 millones de personas
19.5
necesitarán
million
asistencia
people will
humanitaria,
need
reflejando
humanitarian
el impacto
assistance.
devastador
This
del
reflects the
conflicto,
devastating
colapso económico
impact of
y
the
falta de
conflict,
acceso a servicios
economic
básicos.
collapse and lack of access
Panamá
to basic
insiste
services.
en la urgente
Panama
necesidad
insists on
de
the
facilitar
urgent
el
need
flujo de
to
asistencia
facilitate the
humanitaria.
flow of humanitarian
Recordamos a
assistance.
todas
We
las
would
partes
like to
su
remind all
obligación de
parties
garantizar
of
que
their
esta ayuda llegue de
obligation
manera
to
directa a
ensure
los
that
civiles que la
help
necesitan, conforme a lo dispuesto en
reaches
las
directly the
resoluciones
civilians that
adoptadas
need
por
it
este
in
Consejo.
accordance with the
Como nación
decisions
marítima,
adopted by this council.
condenamos
As a
enérgicamente
maritime
los
nation,
ataques
we
a
strongly
embarcaciones comerciales
condemn
en el Mar
attacks
Rojo
against
por
commercial
parte
shipping
de
in the Red
hutíes.
Sea by the Houthis.
Estos actos de violencia
These
ponen en riesgo
violent
la seguridad
actions
marítima
put at risk
internacional
international
y
maritime
comprometen el
security
tránsito
and
de las naves, lo que afecta
compromise the transit of
directamente las
ships.
cadenas de
This
suministro
directly affects
globales
global
y la ayuda
supply
humanitaria
chains
que
and the
necesita la región.
humanitarian
El
aid
derecho a
that
la
the region
navegación es un
requires. The
principio
right to
fundamental del
navigation is a
derecho
fundamental
internacional
principle of
que debe ser
international law
respetado por
that
todos los
must be
estados y
upheld by
actores
all states and
internacionales.
international
El
actors.
compromiso de la República
The
de Panamá
commitment
con el
of the
derecho a la
Republic of
navegación
Panama to the
se
right
manifiesta a través de su
freedom of
administración
navigation is
eficiente y neutral del
manifested
Canal
through
de Panamá,
its
lo que
efficient and
reafirma
neutral
su respeto
administration
por
of
la
the Panama
soberanía
Canal,
y los
which
derechos
reaffirms our
internacionales.
respect for
Desde el
sovereignty and
inicio de los ataques en
international law.
noviembre de
Since the
2023,
beginning of the
con el secuestro
attacks
del
in
buque de
November of
carga Galaxy
2023
Leader
with the
y su tripulación,
detention
que aún
of the cargo
permanecen
ship
como rehenes de
Galaxy
los
Leader and
rebeldes
its crew,
hutíes,
which remain
cuya
as
liberación total
hostages
exigimos de
by
manera
the
inmediata e incondicional,
Houthi rebels,
se han registrado
and their liberation
136
must be
ataques a
immediate and
buques
unconditional.
comerciales,
Since then, there have
de
been
los cuales más de una
136
docena
attacks against
han
commercial
sido a
ships,
naves con bandera
and
panameña,
over a dozen
incluyendo buques
have
petroleros.
been against
El
ships
ataque a
flying
estos
the
buques
Panamanian
representa,
flag,
además,
including oil
un grave
tankers.
peligro al
These
medio ambiente.
attacks against ships
Panamá también
represent, in
condena
addition to everything, a
enérgicamente
grave
los ataques contra el
environmental
personal
danger.
de asistencia
Panama
humanitaria,
condemns in the
las
strongest terms
organizaciones
attacks
no
against
gubernamentales y el
humanitarian
personal de las
staff,
Naciones Unidas,
non-governmental
así como sus
organizations and
detenciones
United Nations
arbitrarias
staff,
e
as well as
injustificadas.
their unjustified and
Estos
arbitrary
trabajadores
detentions.
humanitarios
These
arriesgan
humanitarian
sus
workers
vidas y
risk their
operan en
lives
condiciones
and operate
extremas
in
para brindar
extreme
asistencia
conditions
a
to
quienes más
bring
lo
assistance to
necesitan.
those who need it
Este
most.
tipo de actos
These
son
types of actions
completamente
are
inaceptables
completely
y deben
unacceptable
cesar
and
de
must
inmediato.
cease immediately.
Todas las detenciones
All
de manera arbitraria
detentions that are
deben
arbitrary,
ser liberados.
all those who have been detained
Y todas
arbitrarily
las
must
acciones
be
que de
released.
manera directa o
And
indirecta
all actions that
impidan
directly
la
or
asistencia
indirectly
humanitaria
prevent
deben cesar.
humanitarian assistance
Señor
must cease
Presidente,
immediately.
Reiteramos nuestra
Mr.
profunda
President, we'd like to
preocupación por la
reiterate
crítica
our
situación
deep
en Yemen
consternation
y hacemos un
about the
llamado
critical
urgente a
situation
todas
in
las
Yemen,
partes
and would like to make an
involucradas
urgent appeal
para que
to
den
all the parties
prioridad al
involved to
bienestar del
prioritize the
sufrido pueblo
well-being
yemení.
of the long-suffering
Es
people of Yemen.
fundamental avanzar
It
hacia
is
una solución
essential
integral y
to move
sostenible
towards a
que respete
comprehensive and
plenamente
sustainable
los derechos
solution
humanos y las
that,
normas del
based
derecho
on the full
internacional,
respect of
incluidas
human
las leyes
rights and the norms
humanitarias.
of international law,
Solo a
including
través de un
humanitarian
compromiso
laws.
genuino
Only
con
through
el
a
diálogo,
genuine commitment
el
to
cese de
dialogue and the
hostilidades
cessation
y la
of
cooperación
hostilities and
internacional
international
será posible
cooperation
lograr
will it be
estabilidad en la
possible to
región.
achieve stability in
Muchas
the region.
gracias.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Pakistan thanks Algeria for convening this important briefing. We also thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Messiah for their valuable updates on Yemen. Pakistan remains deeply concerned about the protracted conflict in Yemen, which has triggered a multidimensional crisis, including economic collapse, climate impacts, and one of the worst humanitarian emergencies in modern history. Pakistan strongly believes that conflict in Yemen must be resolved through diplomatic and political means. We urge all parties to prioritize dialogue, engage in a Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process, and resolve differences through peaceful means. We fully support the United Nations and regional efforts, particularly by Saudi Arabia and Oman, to reach a political settlement of the Yemeni conflict based upon agreed frameworks. Pakistan appreciates the significant progress made in December 2023 peace negotiations, which led to vital agreements between the parties to stop hostilities through a nationwide ceasefire, initiate economic revival, resume oil exports, and ensure the payment of public sector salaries. It is crucial to preserve these gains, establish a roadmap, and fully implement commitments to foster sustainable peace. Mr. President, Pakistan is deeply concerned at the airstrikes on Yemen. Israeli airstrikes on Yemen's civilian infrastructure, including Sana'a International Airport, Red Sea ports, and power stations, have caused civilian casualties, further exacerbating the dire humanitarian and political crisis in Yemen. We are also deeply concerned over Houthi attacks on commercial and maritime vessels in the Red Sea, which threaten global trade, regional stability, and the environment. Mr. President, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains one of the gravest in the world. Nearly half the population, 17 million people, is facing severe food insecurity, with 3.5 million suffering from acute malnutrition. The impact of climate change, including floods and droughts, further exacerbate the humanitarian crisis, displacing 4.5 million people. Addressing this requires a robust and coordinated international response. We urge donor countries to increase their contributions to the 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan for Yemen. Pakistan expresses deep concern over the detention of United Nations and humanitarian personnel by the Houthis in violation of international humanitarian law. We echo the Secretary General's call for their immediate and unconditional release. Mr. President, the situation in Yemen cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader regional dynamics, including the ongoing Israeli military onslaught in Gaza. The Security Council must remain united and take measures to promote a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and ensure de-escalation in the region. Pakistan reaffirms its commitment to supporting the Special Envoy's efforts to facilitate a Yemeni-led, Yemeni-owned political process under UN auspices. Diplomacy and dialogue remain the only viable paths to achieving lasting peace in Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I extend my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Acting USG Joyce Msuya for their informative updates. I also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen at the Security Council today. As we gather for the first Yemen briefing of 2025, unfortunately, tensions surrounding the country have been intensifying, while we are simultaneously witnessing glimpses of hope in the broader region. In this light, I'd like to highlight the following points today. First, regarding the ongoing hostilities. It is crucial for the Security Council to send a strong, unified, and unequivocal message, clearly condemning such inflammatory actions. The Houthis persist with their logic of attacking vessels in the Red Sea and escalating attacks on Israel unless the situation in Gaza is resolved. This rationale is misguided, unacceptable, and undermines not only stability in Yemen, but also in the wider region, jeopardizing diplomatic efforts in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. Houthi hostilities reflect a deliberate exploitation of regional volatility for their parochial interests. At the same time, Israel's response to Houthi attacks must align with international law, including international humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians and the civilian infrastructure under all circumstances. Second, on the arms embargo, the Security Council must ensure the full implementation of all relevant Security Council resolutions. The Houthis are deploying advanced weapon systems, including ballistic missiles, UAVs, and so-called hypersonic missiles. However, it is clear they do not possess the capacity to develop and produce such armaments without key external assistance. As such, if any country facilitates the provision of arms or related material, this constitutes a blatant violation of the targeted arms embargo. Furthermore, any active military assistance or cooperation with the Houthis pours more fuel on the fire and deepens regional destabilization. In this connection, we expect the Council will adopt a resolution later this afternoon emphasizing the importance of implementing the arms embargo, reflecting the panel of experts' findings. Third, on the humanitarian situation, the worsening humanitarian crisis in Yemen is deeply concerning as civilian infrastructure and humanitarian workers continue to face severe threats. Hodeidah port, a vital lifeline for the Yemeni people, has reportedly dropped to just 30% of its original operational capacity following recent strikes. Ensuring the full operation of the Hodeidah port and other key infrastructure is essential for the delivery of international humanitarian assistance. This Council should be sending a clear message, prioritizing the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian workers. The Council must also remain united in strongly condemning the arbitrary detention of UN, NGOs, civil society, and diplomatic personnel by the Houthis, and consistently urging their immediate and unconditional release. In this regard, we highly commend the ongoing efforts of the Secretary General, Special Envoy, and the UN agencies in leveraging all possible channels to secure the release of all detainees. Fourth, on the political process, we hope that the rapidly changing dynamics in the Middle East will present a new, timely opportunity for revitalizing dialogue and advancing the political roadmap in Yemen. We note with appreciation Special Envoy's recent visit to Sana'a to lay the groundwork for tangible progress in the political process. The Security Council must continue to fully support the Special Envoy's tireless efforts with a unified voice. We urge all parties, including particularly the Houthis, to respond constructively. In conclusion, Mr. President, bearing in mind that peace and security in the Middle East is an interconnected puzzle comprised of separate yet inherently linked pieces, and seizing upon the current opportunity, the international community should redouble its efforts to encourage the Houthis to reverse their current stance and demonstrate greater flexibility. We also believe that all key regional stakeholders must engage more actively to this end to foster a more secure and peaceful region in 2025. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President,
我要感谢格伦德
I
伯
wish
格
to
特使
thank
和
Special
米苏
Envoy
亚助理
Grunberg
秘书
and
长通报，
ESG
欢
Masuya
迎也
for
门
their
代表出
briefings,
席今天
and
的
I
会议。
welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen in
近
today's
期也
meeting.
门和红海紧张
Recently,
局势加
tensions
剧，
in
存
Yemen
在
and
进
Red
一步
Sea
升级
have
风险。
increased, with a risk of
胡塞
further
武装和以色
escalation.
列持续
While the
相互袭
Houthis and
击，
Israel continue to
美
attack
国、
each
以色
other,
列
the
频
United
繁
States and
空袭
Israel
也门。
frequently struck Yemen from
中方
air.
重申，
China
军事手
reiterates
段
that
不
military
是出
means
路，
are not the way out.
以暴易暴只会让
Violence
冲
for
突陷
violence
入
will
螺
only
旋
drive the
升级的
conflict into
恶
a
性循
vicious
环。
circle of spiraling
胡塞
escalation.
武装应
On one
停
hand,
止
the
袭扰
Houthis
商
should
船，
stop harassing commercial
维护
vessels
红海
and
水域的
safeguard the
航道安
safety
全。
of shipping lanes in the Red
有关
Sea.
国家应
On the
停止
other,
对也门
relevant
的空
countries
袭，
should stop
切
airstrikes
实
on
尊重也
Yemen
门主
and
权、
effectively
安全
respect
和领
Yemen's
土完整。
sovereignty, security, and
所有
territorial
有关
integrity.
各方
All
均
parties
应保
concerned
持
should
冷静
remain
克制，
calm and
避免
exercise
可能加
restraint
剧
and
局
avoid
势
actions
紧
that
张的
may
行动。
escalate tensions.
政治解决也门问
The
题
political
是国际社
settlement
会
of
的
the
普遍期
Yemeni
待，
issue
也是
is the
安理
common
会长
expectation
期
of
的
the
努力
international
方向。
community and the
也门
long-term
各
goal
方应
of the
积极
Security
回应
Council.
国际社
All
会的呼
Yemeni
声，
parties should actively
展现
respond to
责
the
任
call
担
of the
当，
international community,
恢复
show
对
their
话沟通，
responsibility, resume dialogue
寻
and
找打
communication,
破政治
find way
僵
out
局
of
的
the
出路，
political
共
impasse,
同推
and
进
jointly
野人主导、
advance a
野人
comprehensive
所有的
political process
全面
that is
政治进程。
Yemeni-led and owned.
近日，格伦德伯
Recently,
格特使
Special
赴也
Envoy
门和地
Grunberg
区国
went to
家开
Yemen
展
and
新一轮
regional
斡旋，
countries
中
for
方
another round
对此
of
表示欢迎，
mediation. China welcomes
支持
this
特使
and
为推动
supports
各
the
方增
Special
进互
Envoy
信、
in
凝
making
聚
greater
共识
efforts to
做出
promote mutual
更大的
trust
努力。
and forge consensus amongst all parties.
也门人道形
The
势严峻，
humanitarian
令
situation
人
in
担忧。
Yemen is worryingly
国际社会
dire.
应加
The
大对也
international
门的援
community
助力
should
度。
step up assistance to Yemen.
联合国要
The
优
United
先落实
Nations
粮食
should
安全、
prioritize
公共卫
implementing
生
the、project
清洁水
such key
等
areas as
重点领
food
域项
security,
目，
public health, and
保
clean
障
water
民众
to
最迫切
to
的
meet
生
the
活
most
需求。
urgent needs of the people.
近期，联合国同有关
Recently,
各
the
方加
United
强沟
Nations
通
has
协调，
strengthened
推动
communication and
改善
coordination
也门
with
全境
relevant
的人
parties
道行
in
动，
an effort to
释放
improve
所有
humanitarian
被扣押人
operation
员。
throughout Yemen and
中
release
方对
all
有关的努
detainees.
力和
China
取得的进
commends
展
the
表示赞
relevant
赏。
efforts and progress made.
加沙停火有助于缓和
There's a
红海
strong
紧张局势，
consensus
这
amongst
是
the
安理
Council
会成员的
members
强烈
that
共
a
识。
ceasefire in Gaza would help
近日
ease
围绕加
tensions
沙
in the
停
Red
火出
Sea.
现积极进
Recently,
展
there，have been positive developments
未来
regarding
几
the
天对加
ceasefire in
沙局
Gaza.
势走
The
向
next few
非
days
常
will
关
be
键。
critical to the trajectory
我
of
们期待各
developments in
方真
Gaza.
正
We
展
hope
现
that all parties
政
will
治意愿，
truly
采
demonstrate
取
political will
实际行
and
动，
take concrete
推
actions
动加沙
to
停火
turn the
由
vision
愿景
of a ceasefire
变
in
成现
Gaza
实，
into
为
reality,
饱受苦
so
难
as
的
to
加沙
bring
民众
hope
带来
to the
希望，
suffering people in
为
Gaza
岌岌可危
and
的
create
中东乱局
conditions for
降温
cooling down the
创造条件。
precarious chaos in the Middle East.
主席，
President,
这是安理会今年
this is
首
the
次审议
first
也门
time
问
this
题
year that。
我们
Council
期待
has
在国际
considered
社会的
Yemen.
共同
We
努力
hope
下
that，with
也
considered
门的
efforts
情
of
况在
international
新的一
community,
年里
the situation in
能有所
Yemen
好
will
转，
improve in the new
取得
year
新进
and
展，
make
呈现
new
新面貌
progress。and take on new
我们愿同
look.
国际社
We're
会一
ready
道，
to work
继续
with
为
the
政治
international
解决也
community
门问
to
题，
continue to make
维护
unrelenting
中东地
efforts
区的
for
和
the
平稳
political
定
settlement of the
做
Yemen
出
issue
不
and
懈
peace
努
and
力。
stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, President. Special Envoy Grunberg and Assistant Secretary Msuya, thank you very much for your briefing. I welcome the Yemeni delegation to this meeting. Mr. President, sadly we see that for the Yemeni people, the year starts with another spiral of violence and another serious escalation, which Slovenia condemned at the emergency session of the Council on December the 30th, and which we condemn once again today. Reckless Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and against Israel have continued, and severe Israeli retaliations, including as recently as last week, have led to significant damage to Yemen's critical civilian infrastructure. Reports that Hodeidah port is functioning at only about 30% capacity are extremely concerning. The ports are crucial lifeline for Yemen, both from a humanitarian and economic perspective. The situation is unsustainable and unacceptable. The people of Yemen should not be used as a pawn in a geopolitical game. They simply cannot endure another assault following 10 long years of war. Neither do the people of Palestine benefit from this tit for tat. We therefore renew our call on all parties to cease attacks and to adhere to international law, including international humanitarian law. We stress in particular that attacks on civilian population, infrastructure, and objects are prohibited. We look forward to the adoption of a resolution which renews the Secretary General reporting mandate on Red Sea attacks, and thank the US and Greece for their efforts as penholders. We once again express our serious concern about the potential environmental impact of such attacks, made evident by the recent situation with the MV Union tanker. We regret that this aspect could not be reflected in the current resolution and hope to see it incorporated in future texts. Slovenia also recalls the desperate need for a ceasefire in Gaza, which we believe would bring much-needed calm to the entire region. Mr. President, it is clear that a policy of diplomacy rather than firepower must be pursued. We therefore welcome the Special Envoy's intensified engagement with national and regional actors in recent weeks, and note his recent visit to Sana'a, as well as discussions with a diverse range of Yemeni stakeholders. We urge regional actors with influence to press for tangible actions from all sides toward de-escalation and confidence building. We call on all parties to seize the moment and show a genuine commitment to peace and governance by engaging on the UN roadmap and progressive and inclusive intra-Yemeni political process. The gain made in 2023 should not be lost or reversed. Mr. President, we face a time of soaring humanitarian needs in Yemen and across the region, as well as unprecedented pressures for the humanitarian community. In a world where too often we cannot make the necessary political and diplomatic breakthroughs, humanitarians, time and time again, are picking up the pieces. The detention of humanitarian workers by the Houthis last year is not only in contravention of international law, but it is an affront to those life-saving efforts. We conclude our statement today with a clear and simple call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained UN staff and humanitarian and civil society personnel in Yemen, and for the respect and protection of humanitarians the world over. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, I'm honored to deliver a statement on behalf of A3+, namely Algeria, Guyana, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Somalia. We express our gratitude to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, and the ASG for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, Ms. Joyce Msuya, for the invaluable updates on the situation in Yemen. I would also like to welcome the Permanent Representative of Yemen to this meeting. The A3 reiterates its steadfast support for United Nations-led initiatives and regional efforts, including those spearheaded by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman, to achieve a Yemeni-owned and Yemeni-led political settlement. A balanced and inclusive process with robust engagement of women and youth remains essential for resolving the conflict and addressing the aspirations of Yemeni people. We emphasize the importance of maintaining the progress achieved in peace negotiation and encourage the continued leadership of the United Nations in these mediation efforts. In light of the recent development, the A3+ underscores the following concerns and priorities. First, the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel. The A3 reiterates its call for the immediate and unconditional release of all detained humanitarian and UN personnel by the Houthis. The arbitrary detention of this personnel, as well as the civil society members, constitute a severe violation under the international humanitarian law. In this regard, we once again urge the Houthis to cease the practice of arbitrarily detaining humanitarian workers will provide life-saving services to the people of Yemen. We also strongly condemn the continued targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, such as recent drone attack on the market in Taiz province, resulting in multiple fatalities and injuries in recent attack in Hinka al-Mas'ud in Bayda province. Second, escalating food insecurity. Food insecurity in Yemen has worsened significantly, with WFP's reporting a dramatic rise in households unable to meet basic needs. Projections indicate that 17 million people, or 49% of the population, will face a severe food shortage in 2025, with 5 million facing emergency-level conditions and 3.5 million experiencing acute malnutrition. A3 urges swift international actions to adequately fund the humanitarian response plan for Yemen. Third, threats to maritime safety and environment. The Houthis' attack on the Red Sea poses a serious risk to global shipping and maritime ecosystem, with long-lasting consequence for the Red Sea delicate marine environment. The A3 expresses its continued concern over these attacks and call for the Houthis to immediately halt these activities. Fourth, external military actions. Escalating external attacks, including Israel's airstrike on Yemeni territories and the broader implication of a Gaza conflict, undermine the peace-building efforts. We urge all parties, including regional and international actors, to prioritize diplomatic channels and cease military actions in Yemeni territories. Any further escalations carry significant risk of exacerbating regional tensions and worsening the situation facing the Yemeni population. We further emphasize the importance of maintaining stability and fostering dialogue. In this regard, we call on the Houthis to cease actions that exacerbate tensions in the region, as such behavior undermines efforts toward peace and reconciliation. It's imperative that all parties demonstrate restraint and commit to constructive engagement to achieve lasting solutions. In this regard, we stress once again that only diplomatic efforts and political dialogue can solve the Yemeni crisis, not military interventions. In light of these challenges, the A3+ firmly maintains that securing an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza is a critical first step toward lasting peace throughout the region. This ceasefire is essential for halting further escalation and creating the environment of genuine and comprehensive peace process. In conclusion, we emphasize the critical importance of maintaining focused international engagement with Yemen. The A3 reaffirms its support for the Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned peace process under the UN auspices and calls for collaborative international engagement to achieve lasting peace and stability in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by expressing my gratitude to Special Envoy Hans Grundberg and Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Msuya, for the valuable briefings. I also warmly welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Yemen. Mr. President, Greece remains deeply concerned by the escalating use of force, inflammatory rhetoric, and persistent volatility in the region, with the situation in Yemen being of increasingly growing concern. We are particularly alarmed by the Houthis' continued aggression, including unjustified attacks with the use of advanced weaponry, such as ballistic missiles and drones. These attacks have targeted civilian infrastructure, including oil terminals under the control of the government of Yemen, further exacerbating tensions. In this context, we call on all parties to exercise restraint, prioritize dialogue and diplomacy, and avoid actions that led to further escalation, particularly those resulting in civilian casualties. Greece unequivocally supports all efforts of the Special Envoy towards the political process in Yemen, aiming for a sustainable and permanent ceasefire that can pave the way for a lasting peace settlement. At this critical juncture, We emphasize the importance of unity within the Presidential Leadership Council and the need to increase support towards the Yemeni government. Additionally, it's imperative to prevent any actors from exploiting regional or internal circumstances to extend the influence and jeopardize prospects for stability in Yemen. We also stress the importance of unity within the Security Council in addressing the Yemen file. Mr. President, I would like to highlight 4 key points of particular importance for my country regarding Yemen. First, respect for international law. Full adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, is paramount and must be upheld by all parties. On that note, we urge the Houthis to release the Envoy Galaxy leader and its crew, which are unjustifiably detained since November 2023. Second, commitment for a political solution. We urge all Yemeni actors to actively work towards a sustainable and permanent ceasefire as a pathway to preventing escalation. This would allow for a renewed, inclusive, Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned political process under UN auspices, ensuring meaningful participation from all segments of Yemeni society, including women and youth. Third, humanitarian support and protection. The international community must urgently scale up financial support for Yemen's humanitarian response plan and enhance OCHA activities. Simultaneously, we strongly condemn the arbitrary detention of UN personnel, diplomatic staff, and humanitarian workers. We echo the call for their immediate and unconditional release. Fourth, maritime security and freedom of navigation. Greece places particular emphasis on maritime security and the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and Bab al-Mandeb, and for that reason, together with the USA, we have co-penned the renewal of the Red Sea resolution. We join others in calling on the Houthis to immediately cease all attacks on commercial shipping in the region, in accordance with the Resolution 2722 of 2024 and 2739 of 2024. Greece leads the UN Maritime Security Operation Aspides and hosts its headquarters, established to safeguard freedom of navigation in response to the Red Sea crisis pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2722. We emphasize the defensive nature of this operation and reaffirm our resolve to counter threats to maritime security and freedom of navigation in the area. Mr. President, in conclusion, we support the draft resolution of the Red Sea, proposed as co-facilitators jointly with the USA as co-pen holders, and stand ready to further support the relaunch of the political process in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. Je donne maintenant la parole à la représentation de France.
To the representative of France. Thank you.
Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier l'envoyé spécial du secrétaire général
Special Envoy of the Secretary General Hans Grunberg, as well as Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Joyce Msuya for their presentations.
Je voudrais également saluer la présence
I would also like to welcome here
représentant permanent du
the permanent representative of Yemen.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
la France condamne avec fermeté
France
les attaques
condemns in
menées
the strongest terms the attacks carried out by Houthis against Israel for the past few weeks, including on the 13th of January, which targeted the south of Israel. These must cease immediately, as well as their attacks on the Red Sea against commercial vessels, which are continuing in spite of the adoption by the Security Council of Resolution 2722.
The
destabilizing actions by the Houthis, supported by Iran, in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and against Israel, using missiles and drones, violate international law, including the resolutions adopted by this Council. The Houthis carry an overwhelming responsibility for the regional crisis underway, and their actions once again demonstrate their complete indifference toward the suffering of the Yemeni people. France reiterates the appeal of the Council, Security Council, in favor of the immediate and unconditional release of the Galaxy leader and its crew detained for over a year.
La France réaffirme son attachement à la stabilité du Yémen et à la sécurité régionale. Elle rappelle la nécessité d'éviter toute nouvelle escalade dans la région et appelle l'Iran à cesser son soutien aux actions déstabilisatrices au Moyen-Orient. Elle poursuivra son engagement dans le cadre de l'opération défensive de politique de sécurité et de défense de l'Union européenne, Aspides,
defense and security policy of the European Union called ASPIDES to protect the maritime security and freedom of navigation in conformity with international law and in cooperation with our partners. Mr. President, France continues to call for the immediate and unconditional release of dozens of UN and humanitarian personnel, local and international, that have been detained by Houthis scandalously and in contravention to international law. We furthermore urge Houthis to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access and to put an end to any campaign of disinformation against humanitarian actors.
Alors que les Yéménites sont déjà épuisés par des années de conflit et la hausse continue de l'insécurité alimentaire, le Yémen est désormais le pays le plus touché par le choléra à l'échelle mondiale. Les Houthis doivent tout mettre en œuvre pour permettre au personnel humanitaire de vacciner les populations les plus vulnérables. Monsieur le Président, le contexte régional ne doit pas nous faire perdre de vue l'objectif de parvenir à bâtir une paix durable au Yémen. Nous réitérons notre plein soutien à l'envoyé spécial, M. Hans Grunberg, pour ses efforts pour préparer la nécessaire reprise du processus de paix. Seule une solution politique permettra une cessation complète et durable des hostilités et garantira aux populations une vie digne. Il est primordial d'éviter toute reprise de conflit sur le terrain. L'unité du Conseil présidentiel yéménite est essentielle, de même que le renforcement du gouvernement yéménite. De leur côté, les Houthis doivent revenir à la table des négociations sous la conduite de l'envoyé spécial. La France souligne l'importance de négociations inclusives garantissant une participation de l'ensemble de la société civile et notamment des femmes yéménites.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, признательны спецпосланнику генерального секретаря по Йемену Хансу Грюнбергу и помощнику генерального секретаря ООН по гуманитарным вопросам Джойн Мсуя за их доклады. Считаем основной задачей Совета на Йеменском направлении всемерно способствовать продвижению процессов, ведущих к нормализации ситуации в этой стране. Необходимо максимально содействовать нахождению сторонами конфликта, включая движение Ансара, точек соприкосновения и выводить их на компромисс. С своей стороны поддерживаем соответствующий настрой спецпосланника Грюнберга, готовы и далее оказывать ему всю возможную помощь. Текущие события подтверждают острую необходимость безотлагательного срочного выхода на соответствующие договоренности между политсилами в этой стране, официального оформления дорожной карты урегулирования и запуска полноценного полевого процесса в Йемене. При этом важно последовательно преодолевать антагонизм сторон, оккупирующих воинские. Мировые державы и региональные игроки
global powers and regional players need to help them instead of linking additional preconditions to the launch of the Yemen political process. We call upon the Special Envoy to consolidate the already existing positive elements and on that basis to attempt to establish a robust configuration for mediation efforts. At the same time, we observe that instability in the Middle East region, unfortunately, is directly impacting on prospects for political resolution in Yemen. Israel's inhumane military operation in the Gaza Strip has been ongoing for more than a year, and Israel's actions in Lebanon and Syria are categorically condemned on the Arab street, so to speak, and they cannot but, or rather they inevitably affect this Middle East country. Fuel is added to the fire by the turbulence in adjacent waters, including the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Russian Federation repeatedly cautioned about the risks of such developments. The Russian Federation continuously called for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and highlighted the inadmissibility of further regional escalation, which is fraught with risks of dragging in more and more Middle East states, albeit
indirectly into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. At the moment, we unfortunately have scant grounds for optimism. Mr. President, a prompt resolution to the military political crisis in Yemen is necessary amid the continuously deteriorating humanitarian situation. Ordinary civilians in the country have been enduring hunger and epidemics of communicable diseases. The activity of humanitarian workers in that country has become increasingly difficult. We regret the fact that there remains the unresolved issue of the detention by Ansar Allah of UN staff on the ground. We wish to recall the fact that humanitarian workers enjoy privileges and immunities with which all parties have an obligation to comply. We note the ongoing efforts by the United Nations, including Special Envoy Grunberg, efforts which are geared towards meticulously shedding light on what transpired, ensuring humanitarian access, and establishing conditions for the eventual release of the detained. And for our part, we are also working towards achievement of this objective. It is clear that there is an important need for the international community to unite and to step up efforts to address the Yemen humanitarian crisis. We note with profound regret, however, that the actions of certain parties are geared towards achievement of the opposite. Specifically, we are exceedingly concerned by the ongoing strikes targeting Yemen port infrastructure in Hodeidah, Salif, and Ras Isa by the so-called coalition, which has been cobbled together by the United States and their satellites. And this, despite the fact that these ports are critical objects for delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in Yemen. Through them, much humanitarian cargo is provided. Most of the humanitarian cargo is provided through these, including food, medicines, and other basic necessities. However, this has not stopped our Western colleagues. And so, as a result of the latest coordinated airstrike by the U.S., UK, and Israel on 10th of January, much of the infrastructure has been made non-operational. As a result, the ability to accept goods has significantly deteriorated, and this is something that humanitarian workers have highlighted. If this is the result that Western aggressors wish to credit themselves with, then this is possibly the only achievement in their military campaign against the Houthis, which not only failed to reduce their military capabilities, but also failed to influence their position on regional problems. We are not justifying Houthi strikes on Israeli territory. We understand that the actions of West Jerusalem are frequently retaliatory in nature. However, at the same time, the reaction of military personnel needs to be commensurate. It is now in Israel's interest to exercise restraint and to refrain from escalatory measures. We trust that West Jerusalem is cognizant of the need to adjust their destructive policy in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Envoy Grunberg and Assistant Secretary General Musaya, for your briefings that underscored the precarious situation in Yemen. This Council is well aware that recent threats from the Houthis to international peace and security have been the focus of recent meetings. In a December 30th emergency meeting, Assistant Secretary General Khiari rightly condemned the Houthis' reckless decision to prioritize their aggressive regional ambitions by attacking international shipping in the Red Sea, and he highlighted the harmful repercussions of their unprovoked attacks. Salvage experts just completed their work on the Sunyon, months after a Houthi attack left that ship adrift and ablaze, filled with millions of barrels of oil. Just a few weeks prior, we heard a first-hand account from a briefer who described the harrowing details of his abduction and unjustified detention by the Houthis. He spoke for all those who currently sit in Houthi detention, unable to see their loved ones, and subject to terrible abuse. The situation continues to deteriorate. In recent days, the Houthis have expanded their campaign of detaining innocent Yemenis, targeting more former embassy staff simply trying to do their jobs. They continue to hold UN, diplomatic, and NGO staff rounded up over the summer, as well as the crew of the Galaxy Leader, now as de facto hostages for more than a year, while conducting armed raids in Sana'a. Colleagues, this leaves the inevitable question: will this Council continue to stand by idly with such escalations? We cannot simply make more calls that are ignored. The United States believes the time has come to respond to the growing Houthi threat by holding Iran to account for enabling the Houthis' long-range missile attacks on international shipping and on Israel, attacks that we strongly condemn. That is why we advocated for reauthorization language requiring the Secretary General's periodic reports to this Council include information about the provision of advanced weaponry being used in the increasingly sophisticated attacks. We also must take action to deprive the Houthis of illicit revenues that sustain their attacks and recognize the growing relationship between the Houthis and other terrorist groups like al-Shabaab, including through the use of targeted sanctions. The United States continues to take action in response to Houthi threats. On January 8th, U.S. armed forces conducted multiple precision strikes against 2 Houthi underground advanced conventional weapons storage facilities used to conduct attacks against U.S. Navy warships and merchant vessels. Despite what Russia says about these and past actions, the fact is these strikes were consistent with international law and were taken in the exercise of the United States' inherent right to self-defense. Even as we grapple with Houthi threats, we must not lose sight of the continued suffering of Yemenis, particularly due to Houthi obstruction and restricted humanitarian access, and those who face food insecurity and other staggering challenges. More than half of Yemen's population remain in need of humanitarian assistance. So the United States continues to support the work of the UN and our humanitarian partners who are delivering critical health, nutrition, water, sanitation, and hygiene assistance to the people of Yemen. We must collectively do more to support the humanitarian response in Yemen. As the world's leading donor of humanitarian assistance to Yemen, the United States calls upon the international community to provide more financial support to mitigate Yemen's dire humanitarian crisis, while also pressing the Houthis to ensure that humanitarian organizations can operate unhindered without Houthi interference or threats to detain their staff. We also call upon donors to support the promotion of effective governance during the visit of Yemen's Prime Minister and his delegation to New York next week. Houthi attacks must stop for Yemen to avoid worst-case scenarios. The Houthis are the primary responsibility of peace in Yemen. We must all work together and remain committed to a UN-led intra-Yemeni political process aimed at bringing the Yemen conflict to an end. For that to happen, the Houthi attacks and detentions must first end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also like to thank Special Envoy Grunberg and Assistant Secretary Masuya for their briefings and for their continuous efforts on this issue. I also welcome the presence of Yemen, of the representative of Yemen, in our meeting today. Mr. President, our briefers this morning have painted a worrisome picture, one of a precarious and fragile situation edging ever closer to a dangerous brink. I would like to highlight 3 points. First and foremost, de-escalation is absolutely critical. Denmark is deeply concerned by the heightened level of tensions across the Middle East, including the latest increase in attacks between Israel and the Houthis. We call on the Houthis to immediately stop their attacks on Israel and underscore Israel's right to self-defense in line with international law, including the principle of proportionality. We further call on all parties to exercise restraint and to uphold their obligation under international humanitarian law by protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We also stress the importance of keeping Hodeidah port open as a lifeline for millions of Yemenis. We condemn the Houthis' continuous attack on the international merchant vessels in the Red Sea, as well as their continued unjustifiable detention of the Galaxy leader and his 25 crew members, and we demand their immediate release. Any attempt to disrupt the freedom of navigation, upon which international commerce and development rests, is unacceptable and may constitute a violation of international law. To this end, we underscore the need to reinforce the weapons embargo and curb the flow of arms to the Houthis, including by strengthening UNWEM. Mr. President, my second point. Denmark condemns any attempt to restrict, divert, or interfere with the delivery of humanitarian aid. By interfering with humanitarian operations, the Houthis are depriving their own population of vital and life-saving assistance. Put simply, it's costing lives. In the same vein, we firmly condemn the Houthis' arbitrary detention of UN staff, civil society, and staff working for NGOs and diplomatic missions in Yemen. We call for their immediate and unconditional release. It is critical that humanitarian personnel are able to carry out their life-saving work in a safe operating environment. We therefore support UN humanitarian agencies and others on the ground in taking the necessary precautions to ensure their safety when these basic requirements cannot be met. Mr. President, my third point is closely linked to the first two. That is the need for a political solution to this conflict. While we are encouraged by Special Envoy Grunberg's latest visit to Sana'a for the first time in nearly 2 years, the Houthis' actions on other fronts give little reason for optimism. What is needed is for the parties to demonstrate genuine goodwill, to lay down their arms and to engage constructively towards establishing a formal nationwide ceasefire and reinvigorating the Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned inclusive political process, a political process that fully includes women and youth. Special Envoy, your efforts have laid important groundwork too, and you have Denmark's full support. To conclude, the conflict in Yemen has raged for far too long. As always, it is the civilian population that suffers most. They must not become victims of a forgotten conflict. They must remain at the forefront of our minds. Their suffering demands and deserves our attention, and importantly, our action in support of peace in Yemen. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
اسمحوا لي في البداية
At the outset,
أن أتقدم إليكم السيد الرئيس
allow me, Mr. President,
ولبلدكم الجزائر الشقيق على
to
رئاستها
congratulate you and your country,
لمجلس الأمن
Algeria,
هذا
on
الشهر
presiding the Security
وأعرب
Council
عن
for this
خالص
month.
تمنياتنا لكم
We
ولوفدكم
wish you
بالتوفيق
and your
والنجاح
delegation every
كما
luck
أشكر
and
الولايات
success.
المتحدة
We would
الأمريكية
also like
الصديقة على
to thank
رئاستها
the friendly
للمجلس
United
الشهر
States for
الماضي
presiding over the Security
وأتوجه
Council last
بالتهنئة
month. I
للأعضاء
would also
الجدد
like to
غير الدائمين
congratulate the
في هذا
new
المجلس
non-permanent members
الصومال
of the Security Council,
باكستان
Somalia,
واليونان
Pakistan,
والدنمارك
Greece, Denmark,
وبنما
and Panama.
ونتطلع
We
إلى
look
العمل
forward to
معهم
working
ومع
with
بقية
you
أعضاء
and the
المجلس
rest of the Council
لإحلال
to
السلام
achieve
الشامل
a
والمستدام في
comprehensive and
اليمن
sustainable peace
وتخفيف
in
المعاناة
Yemen and to
الإنسانية
alleviate
عن
the
اليمنيين.
humanitarian suffering
كما أشكر
of the
الدول
Yemeni
التي
people.
أنتهت
I would
عضويتها
also
في
like
هذا
to thank the
المجلس على
countries
كل
whose term
إسهاماتهم
has ended
القيمة
for their
في عمل
valuable
مجلس
efforts and
الأمن
contributions
وأتوجه
to the
بالشكر
work of the Security
للسيد
Council.
هانس
I would like
غرونبرغ
to thank Mr. Hans
والسيدة
Grunberg and Ms.
موسويا
Joyce
على
Msuya
إحاطتهما
for their
نشكر
briefings.
الجنرال بيري على كل
We
الجهود
also
التي
would
بذلها
like to thank
خلال فترة مهمته
Major General Berry for his work. Mr. President, through the ongoing military escalation, the terrorist Houthi militias are shirking their responsibilities towards peace. They are undermining all regional and international efforts and the efforts of the United Nations to end this protracted war and the humanitarian crisis of the Yemeni people. At a time when the government of Yemen condemns the attacks of the Israeli entity against Yemen and the violation of its sovereignty, we hold Houthi militias the responsibility of dragging Yemen to the conflict in the region. We warn these militias from continuing to hold the fate of Yemen and the Yemeni people hostage, to drag them to their futile battles in order to serve the interest of their sponsor, the Iranian regime, and its expansionist project in the region. We remind this August Council of the destructive approach of these militias. They have targeted and continue to target the wealth of the Yemeni people for a decade. They are targeting with their terrorist attacks the infrastructure that took decades to build. They're attacking ports, airports, critical oil facilities with ballistic missiles and drones. They are besieging and targeting cities and villages. These terrorist Houthi attacks are not in defense of the Palestinian people in Gaza, as these militias are claiming. This is part of their strategy to destroy Yemen and to destroy the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the Yemeni people, to impose the agendas of its sponsor, the Iranian regime, and to turn Yemen into a platform to threaten security and stability in the region and the world, and to undermine any prospects for building a better future for the Yemeni people. We reaffirm once again that achieving a comprehensive peace in Yemen requires showing commitment and a true desire by these militias to achieve peace and to engage in a positive manner and with goodwill in the regional and international efforts to end the Yemeni crisis. These militias must renounce the choice of war. They must renounce escalation. They must give precedence to the interests of the Yemeni people over the interests of their leaders and their sponsors. They must renounce their terrorist approach to undermine security and stability in Yemen and the region. We call the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities, to implement its relevant resolutions, to provide practical procedures to pave the way towards a comprehensive political process that meets the aspirations of the Yemeni people. We reaffirm once again our will to deal in a positive manner with all regional and UN efforts to reach a comprehensive political settlement that guarantee the end of the coup and restoring state institutions based on the agreed upon terms of reference of a political solution, i.e. the Gulf Initiative and its implementing mechanism and the outcomes of the National Dialogue Conference and relevant Security Council resolutions, notably Resolution 2216. The Houthi militias continue to escalate because there's an absence of the international will to deal with the behaviors of these militias. They continue to perpetrate violations and heinous crimes against the Yemeni people. They're undermining the Stockholm Agreement, and through this agreement they have controlled the city and ports of Hodeidah. They've turned Hodeidah to a base to launch ballistic missiles and drones to undermine regional and international security and stability, to threaten international navigation routes in the Red Sea and the Strait of Bab al-Mandab. We call on the Security Council and the international community to reevaluate their approach when dealing with these Houthi militias, to correct false narrative that complicated this crisis and prolong this conflict and enable these militias to challenge the will of the international community and threaten the countries of the region at a time when we do thank the United Nations for their efforts to guarantee the release of the staff of the United Nations, international organizations, local organizations, and diplomats that have been detained by these militias for over 6 months. However, these efforts are limited to repeated calls and meetings with the leaders of the Houthi militias, including those that are listed on terrorist lists. This has emboldened Houthi militias to continue with their violations, with their crimes, and to disregard the calls of this Council and the international community to release these kidnapped persons. This really shows or reflects an inability of the United Nations and the Security Council to impose real pressures on these militias to guarantee the release of UN staff. Houthi militias continue to perpetrate further crimes and violations against the Yemeni people in blatant violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Damage has befallen every corner in Yemen. The Yemeni people are suffering from an unbearable humanitarian and economic situation. These militias have robbed them of their lives, their security, their future. They're fabricating wars and crises. They're sowing the seeds of racism, division. They're targeting civilian objects, residential cities, and markets. They are killing dozens of innocent civilians, including women and children. And following this crime of targeting a popular market in Taiz early last month, these militias targeted the homes of civilians in Al-Bumia village. This led to the killing of 2 babies and the injuring of 2 others, all of them from one family. Recently, the Houthi militias, the terrorist Houthi militias, targeted the villages of Hankat al-Mas'ud and al-Khasha in al-Baida province. They targeted them with drones, tanks, and artillery. This has led to many civilian casualties. I would have wished that Mr. Grunberg would have named those who are impeding the prospects for peace. These militias are targeting and bombing a number of homes in these villages, causing terror among women and children. They're preventing first responders from reaching those who are injured. They're preventing the delivery of food. They're cutting off water. They're preventing farmers from reaching their fields. They're preventing life-saving medical assistance. And they are launching wide-scale arrest campaigns against the citizens of these villages based on false claims in order to kill them or to ensure their forceful disappearance. These acts are war crimes. They're also kidnapping and arresting politicians, academics, activists, and journalists. Because of their activism, they are practicing the most heinous violations against women. They're kidnapping them from their homes and their workplace. They're throwing them in secret prisons, and they're practicing acts of violence and blackmail against them, in addition to sexual harassment and abuse, as well as physical and psychological torture. They're also recruiting children. They're turning schools into military camps. They're training children to use weapons. They are indoctrinating children in the largest recruitment operation in modern history. These militias have turned the entrance to cities and villages into minefields, killing thousands of civilians and causing lifelong disabilities. These criminal practices have led to the largest internal displacement wave in Yemen. Millions of Yemenis had to flee to internal displacement camps, living in difficult conditions. These militias continue with their brutal crimes against innocent civilians in areas under their control. As the international community remains silent, this is emboldening these militias to continue with their crimes, to disregard human life in blatant violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. President, the Presidential Leadership Council is making every effort to confront the many challenges and to support the efforts of the government of Yemen to provide services to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people, to guarantee an economic performance, to support the reform process, and to improve the performance of institutions at the central and local levels. We are trying to deal with the challenges of the economic situation and providing services to complete procedures to combat corruption, to improve public revenues, to double our efforts to guarantee further humanitarian interventions. We value the positions of our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. They've stood beside the Yemeni people. They've alleviated their humanitarian suffering. We call on all friendly and sisterly countries, as well as donor organizations, to provide urgent support to respond to the priorities of the current period, including by supporting the economic recovery plan and the strategy of the Presidential Leadership Council to deal with these challenges as a result of the war and the escalation from the Houthi militias and the impact this has had on the economic and humanitarian situation. We would also like to thank our brothers from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for the economic support that they've provided to the Yemeni government in the amount of $500 million, $300 million of it as a deposit to the Central Bank of Yemen. The support will help meet urgent needs and allow the state to pay the salaries of state employees. We also value the role of the United Kingdom, which will be holding a high-level ministerial meeting in cooperation with the government of Yemen early next week in order to mobilize economic and political support and the reform efforts of the government to address the current challenges. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Yemen for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.